5 years after the Galactic Council voted to end the quarantine, Jake Martinez stood in the main laboratory of the Interspecies Reality Research Institute and marveled at how much the galaxy had changed. The massive facility orbited a neutral star system and housed scientists from every major civilization, all working together to understand and apply human approaches to reality manipulation. Dr. Paul Anderson, the Institute's human director, was giving Jake a tour of the latest research projects. The past 5 years had seen an explosion of impossible achievements as other species learned to question the limitations they had always accepted as absolute truths. The breakthrough came when we realized that the key wasn't teaching other species human techniques, Dr. Anderson explained as they walked through laboratories filled with impossible machines. The key was teaching them to think like humans about what constitutes a limitation versus what constitutes a suggestion. They paused at a research station where Lisa Carter, now serving as the Institute's chief engineering coordinator, was working, with a team of mixed human and alien scientists. The project they were developing was a new type of faster-than-light drive that operated on principles that would have been considered fantasy just a few years earlier. Traditional FTL drives work by creating artificial space distortions, Lisa explained to the group of trainees gathered around her workstation. Our new drives work by convincing space that the ship is already where it wants to be. The physical movement becomes just a technicality that reality handles automatically. Jake watched as Zephyrian engineer Kextel successfully operated the human-designed drive system. The young Zephyrian had been one of the first non-humans to master reality manipulation techniques, proving that the ability wasn't limited to humanity. The strangest part, Kextel said as he demonstrated the impossible technology, is how natural it feels once you stop thinking of limitations as permanent. My species spent thousands of years accepting that certain things couldn't be done. Now I realize we were just afraid to try. Rachel Martinez, Jake's daughter, had become something of a celebrity as the first non-human to successfully teach reality manipulation to others. At 25, she was already leading research teams and developing new applications of human theoretical frameworks. The important thing to understand, Rachel told a group of graduate students from various species, is that humans didn't discover new laws of physics. We discovered that the old laws were more flexible than anyone realized. Reality wants to be helpful. It just needs someone to ask the right questions. Jake felt proud watching his daughter work with alien students who would have been considered impossible to teach just a few years earlier. The barriers between species were dissolving as everyone learned to approach problems with human-style thinking. Dr. Michelle Chen, the Institute's new director of galactic sciences, joined Jake for the remainder of his tour. She had spent the past 3 years documenting the transformation of galactic civilization, and the results were remarkable. Productivity increases have exceeded our most optimistic projections, Dr. Chen explained as they visited a manufacturing demonstration area. When species stop accepting arbitrary limitations on their capabilities, they accomplish things that were previously unimaginable. The manufacturing area showcased production techniques that combined traditional alien engineering with human reality manipulation principles. Machines that should have required massive energy inputs operated on minimal power. Assembly processes that should have taken days were completed in hours. Quality standards that should have been impossible to maintain were achieved routinely. Danny, Kim, who had transferred from the UES Horizon to help establish the Institute, was training a mixed group of engineers from 6 different species. The key insight, he told his students, is understanding that efficiency isn't about working within energy constraints. It's about convincing energy to be more cooperative with what you're trying to accomplish. Jake watched as a draconian engineer successfully operated equipment that combined human design principles with traditional alien components. The hybrid technologies were proving more capable than either approach could achieve independently. The tour continued to the Institute's Medical Research Division, where Dr. Grace Turner had established protocols for treating patients from species that had never interacted before. Her techniques, based on the human principle that healing transcended specific biological differences, were revolutionizing galactic medicine. We've eliminated most of the diseases that plagued individual species. For millennia, Dr. Turner explained as they observed treatment procedures that seemed to defy biological science. Once you realize that illness is really just healthy systems that have forgotten how to function properly, treatment becomes a matter of reminding bodies what normal feels like. The economic implications of the transformation were equally dramatic. Frank Taylor, now serving as the Institute's economic coordinator, had documented the collapse and rebuilding of galactic financial systems as traditional scarcity-based economics gave way to abundance-based models. When you can convince matter and energy to be more cooperative, Frank explained, traditional economic theories stop making sense. We're having to develop entirely new frameworks for managing resources that can be produced on demand. Jake's tour concluded in the Institute's Communication Center, where Susan White had established instantaneous contact networks connecting every inhabited system in the galaxy. The old limitations of light-speed communication had become obsolete as human techniques allowed information to exist where it needed to be. Without traveling there, the galaxy has become a much smaller place, Susan said as she demonstrated communication systems that operated across thousands of light years with no delay. When you can talk to anyone instantly regardless of distance, the barriers between civilizations disappear pretty quickly. As evening approached, Jake found himself in the Institute's observation lounge with Captain Amy Watson, who had become something of a legend as the human who made first official contact with galactic civilization. They watched ships from dozens of species coming and going from the Institute, all using hybrid technologies that combined the best of traditional engineering with human reality manipulation. "Do you ever regret making that emergency call 5 years ago?" Amy asked. Jake considered the question carefully. The galaxy was certainly a very different place than it had been when the stellar wind sent its desperate distress signal. Old certainties had been overturned, traditional limitations had been discarded, and entire civilizations had been transformed. "No," Jake said finally. "Change was inevitable once people learned what was actually possible. I'm just glad we had a chance to guide that change instead of being overwhelmed by it." Through the observation lounge windows, they could see construction beginning on a new research facility that would dwarf even the current institute. The project was being designed by teams that included every major species in the galaxy, all working together to push the boundaries of what reality would allow. The age of limitations was truly over. In its place, a new era of cooperative impossibility was beginning, where the only constraints on achievement were the limits of imagination itself. And as Jake had learned from his human friends, imagination was just another limitation waiting to be overcome. News of the contact between the stellar wind and human space spread through the galaxy, despite every attempt to keep it secret. Within 2 weeks, the Galactic Council was in emergency session, and every major civilization was demanding answers about what had happened when their ancient quarantine protocols were violated. Ambassador Patricia Lee arrived at the council chambers aboard the diplomatic vessel Terra Nova, accompanied by her aide Stephen Johnson and translator Mary Garcia. As humanity's first official representative to the Galactic Council in over 1,000 years, Patricia carried the weight of potentially changing the entire structure of galactic civilization. The council chamber was a massive sphere that could accommodate representatives from dozens of different species. As Patricia entered, she could feel the mixture of fear, curiosity, and hostility radiating from the assembled delegates. Many species had never seen a human before, and the ancient warnings about humanity had built up over centuries into something approaching religious terror. High Chancellor Mordek of the Zephyrian Empire was the first to address the emergency session. His forearms gestured dramatically as his translator converted his speech into galactic standard. "The quarantine protocols have been violated. For the first time in 1,200 years, aliens have entered human space and returned. We must determine what threat this poses to galactic security." Admiral Curtis Bell, who served as the human liaison officer within Zephyrian Military Command, stood to provide his report. He had interviewed Jake Martinez and his crew extensively after their return from human space, and his findings had sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. "The reports from the Stellar Wind crew confirm our worst fears about human capabilities," Admiral Bell stated. "They possess technology that operates beyond known physical laws. Their ships travel faster than theoretical maximums allow. Their engineers repair equipment using methods that shouldn't work. Their medical staff can treat alien species with techniques that have no scientific basis, yet achieve perfect results. Representative Kethvak of the Draconian Confederation interrupted with aggressive clicking sounds. These are the same impossible claims from the ancient reports. Surely you don't expect the council to believe such obvious exaggerations. Jake Martinez had been invited to testify before the council about his experiences. He stood at the witness platform, still feeling overwhelmed by the implications of what he had seen. With respect, Representative Kethvak, I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it myself. The humans didn't just help us repair our ship. They convinced our broken reactor to work again by essentially asking it politely. That's impossible, declared Science Coordinator Veltara of the Academic Alliance. Machines don't respond to requests or intentions. They operate according to physical principles and engineering specifications. Dr. Janet Ross, humanities lead xenosociologist, requested permission to address the council. She was a calm woman, in her 50s, who had spent her career studying how different species approached problem-solving and reality perception. Honored delegates, Dr. Ross began. I understand your skepticism. What seems impossible to your species is routine for humans, because we developed different fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. You evolved to accept constraints and work within limitations. We evolved to question constraints and find ways around limitations. She activated a holographic display that showed brain scan comparisons between humans and other galactic species. The difference isn't in intelligence or technology. It's in how our neural structures process the concept of impossibility. When other species encounter a barrier, their minds automatically begin working on ways to function within that barrier. When humans encounter a barrier, our minds automatically begin working on ways to go around, through, or over that barrier. Trade Coordinator Frank Taylor had been monitoring the economic implications of renewed human contact. His preliminary reports were causing panic in galactic financial markets. The humans have demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that violate basic economic principles, he announced to the council. Their colonies produce resources at rates that should require 10 times their actual energy input. If their methods become widespread, the entire galactic economy could collapse overnight. Patricia Lee stood to respond to the growing fear in the chamber. Delegates, I understand your concerns, but you're looking at this backwards. Humans aren't a threat to galactic civilization. We're an opportunity. For thousands of years, your species have accepted limitations that were never actually absolute. We can teach you to overcome those limitations and destroy everything we've built in the process. High Chancellor Mordek responded angrily. Our civilizations are based on accepting natural laws and working within established parameters. If everyone starts believing they can ignore physical constraints, chaos will follow. Mary Garcia, who had been monitoring communications traffic during the session, provided a real-time update that stunned the assembly. Delegates, I'm receiving reports from across the galaxy. News of human capabilities has spread to the general population. Engineering teams on 17 different worlds are already attempting to replicate human techniques. 3 separate research institutes have reported successful tests of impossible technologies. The council chamber erupted in alarmed discussions as representatives realized that the secret was already spreading beyond their control. The careful isolation that had protected galactic civilization from human influence for over a millennium was collapsing in real time. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, who had been studying the physiological effects of human contact, provided her analysis of the situation. The psychological barriers that prevent other species from questioning fundamental assumptions can be overcome through exposure to human thinking patterns. Once individuals see that limitations can be ignored, they begin to ignore them automatically. The effect appears to be permanent and self-reinforcing. Stephen Johnson presented economic projections that painted a stark picture of the coming changes. Conservative estimates suggest that widespread adoption of human techniques could increase galactic productivity by 300% within 10 years. However, this would also render obsolete most existing industrial infrastructure and economic models. The debate continued for hours, with representatives arguing about whether to reinforce the quarantine, attempt to contain the spreading knowledge, or embrace the coming transformation. Some species saw opportunity in learning human methods, while others viewed it as an existential threat to their way of life. Finally, Progressive leader Laura Mitchell of the Democratic Union called for a formal vote. We can't uninvent this knowledge or put it back in isolation. The choice before us is simple. We can resist change and watch our civilizations become obsolete, or we can learn from humanity and transform ourselves into something greater. The vote was close, but the motion to end the quarantine and establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity passed by a narrow margin. As the session concluded, Jake realized that his desperate distress call had triggered the most significant transformation in galactic history. The age of limitations was ending, and no one knew what would replace it. Jake Martinez found himself aboard the human space station Harmony 3 days later, still trying to understand what he had witnessed. The Stellar Wind was docked at one of the station's repair bays, though Ryan Clark had fixed most of their problems during the journey to human space. Captain Watson had insisted on bringing them to the station for a complete systems check and to allow the crew to recover from their ordeal. The station was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, where most space installations were built with careful attention to structural engineering and safety margins. Harmony seemed to have been designed by people who viewed physics as more of a suggestion than a law. Sections of the station extended in directions that should have created dangerous stress points, yet everything remained perfectly stable. Susan White, the station's communications officer, was giving Jake and his crew a tour of the facilities. She was a friendly woman in her 30s who seemed genuinely excited to meet aliens for the first time. What disturbed Jake was how casually she discussed things that should have been impossible. The central hub can accommodate ships up to 3 times larger than the docking bays, she explained as they walked through a corridor that was somehow bigger on the inside than it appeared from outside. We just convinced the space to expand when we need it to. Pete Collins had been asking technical questions throughout the tour, and each answer left him more confused. How do you convince space to expand? That doesn't make any physical sense. Susan smiled. Physical sense is really just a matter of perspective. Space wants to be the right size for what we need to put in it. We just help it understand what size that should be. Lisa Brown had been unusually quiet during the tour. Jake could see that she was struggling with the same questions that had been bothering him since their rescue. Everything about human technology seemed to work on principles that contradicted fundamental laws of physics, yet the results were undeniably real. They arrived at the station's main research laboratory, where Dr. Kevin Park was working on what appeared to be a standard stellar cartography project. The middle-aged scientist looked up from his work with a welcoming smile. "Ah, our rescued travelers," Dr. Park said. "How are you adjusting to human space? I imagine it's quite different from what you're used to." "That's an understatement," Jake replied. "Everything here seems to work in ways that should be impossible." Dr. Park nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose it would seem that way to species that accept limitations as absolute truths. Would you like me to explain how we approach reality differently?" Vexitar, who had been silent and nervous throughout the tour, finally spoke up. "The ancient report spoke of humans who could convince reality to change. We thought those were just superstitions or exaggerations." "Oh, they weren't exaggerations," Dr. Park said cheerfully. "We do convince reality to change. We just don't think of it as anything unusual. Reality is much more cooperative than most species realize." He led them to a demonstration area where Tony Miller, the station's security chief, was showing a group of human trainees how to repair equipment. Jake watched in fascination as Tony took a completely burned-out computer terminal and began working on it with tools that seemed inadequate for the job. "The key," Tony explained to his students, "is understanding that broken doesn't mean impossible to fix. It just means the equipment has forgotten how to work properly. Your job is to remind it." Tony connected several components that clearly came from different types of systems and shouldn't have been compatible. He made adjustments that violated basic principles of electronics. Then he turned on the terminal, and it worked perfectly. "How is that possible?" Pete demanded. "Those components aren't even designed to work together." Tony shrugged. They work together because they need to work together. When something is broken and people need it to function, the universe usually finds a way to make it happen. You just have to believe it will work and know how to ask nicely. Dr. Park noticed the bewildered expressions on the alien visitors' faces. I think I should explain the fundamental difference between human thinking and how other species approach problems. Would you like to see a real demonstration? He led them to another section of the lab where Carol Davis, the station's chief engineer, was working on what appeared to be a faster-than-light communication array. The equipment was spread across several work tables and pieces with components that clearly came from different technological backgrounds. Carol, would you mind showing our guests how we approach impossible problems? Dr. Park asked. Carol looked up from her work with a smile. Sure. What we're building here is a communication system that can send messages instantly across any distance. According to traditional physics, this is completely impossible because information cannot travel faster than light. So how do you make it work? Lisa asked. We don't make it work, Carol explained. We just recognize that the limitation isn't real. Information doesn't actually travel when we use this system. Instead, we convince the universe that the information is already where it needs to be. She activated the device and sent a test message to a research station on the far side of human space. The response came back instantly, with no measurable delay for transmission time. The secret, Dr. Park said as they watched the impossible demonstration, is that humans never develop the mental barriers that prevent other species from questioning basic assumptions about reality. Most intelligent life evolves to accept certain limitations as absolute truths. Humans evolved to ignore those limitations. Jake felt a chill as he began to understand the implications. You're saying that the laws of physics aren't actually laws? They're more like guidelines, Dr. Park replied. Very strong suggestions about how things usually work. But when you really need something to work differently, reality is usually willing to negotiate. Grace Turner, the station's medical officer, joined the conversation. She had been treating some minor injuries that Vextar had sustained during their emergency. According to her scans, the Zephyrian should have taken weeks to heal from the radiation exposure. But he was already showing complete recovery. The human medical approach, she explained, is based on the principle that bodies want to be healthy. We just help them remember how to heal themselves. Most diseases and injuries are really just cases where the body has forgotten what normal feels like. Vextar stared at her with all four eyes wide. You treated me with medicines that shouldn't work on Zephyrian physiology. Our species have completely different biochemistry. Biochemistry is just details, Grace said casually. Healing is healing. Carbon-based life forms all want the same basic things: to function properly and maintain themselves. The specific mechanisms matter less than the intention. Jake realized that everything he had witnessed over the past few days followed the same pattern. Humans didn't overcome limitations through advanced technology or superior knowledge. They overcame limitations by refusing to accept that the limitations were real. They approached every problem with the assumption that a solution existed, and somehow reality cooperated with their expectations. This is why the galaxy fears us, Dr. Park said gently, seeing the understanding dawn in Jake's eyes. Not because we're dangerous or aggressive, but because our approach to existence could fundamentally change how every species in the galaxy thinks about what's possible. If everyone started questioning basic assumptions about reality the way humans do, the entire structure of galactic civilization would transform overnight. The tour continued, but Jake barely noticed the remaining demonstrations. His mind was reeling with the implications of what he had learned. Humans hadn't just discovered new technology or developed superior engineering techniques. They had discovered that reality itself was far more flexible than anyone had imagined. And now that he knew the secret, Jake realized that his own species might be capable of the same impossible achievements if they could just learn to think like humans. The response came back so fast that Jake Martinez thought his communication equipment was malfunctioning. According to everything he knew about faster-than-light communication, it should have taken at least 30 minutes for a signal to reach human space and return. The answer came back in less than 3 minutes. Unknown vessel, This is Captain Amy Watson of the UES Horizon. We received your distress signal. We are coming to assist you. Please send your location coordinates and the nature of your emergency. Lisa Brown checked the communication logs 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. Captain, that response time is impossible. Even if they had a ship sitting right on their border, the communication delay alone should have taken longer than that. Pete Collins was running diagnostics on their communication array. The equipment is working fine. Either they have communication technology that's decades ahead of anything in the galaxy, or they were somehow expecting our call. Vextar stood rigid with all 4 arms pressed against his sides. His black eyes were wide with what Jake recognized as pure terror. They knew, he whispered through his translator. Somehow they knew we would call before we even sent the signal. Jake ignored the Zephyrian's fear and responded to the human ship. He transmitted their coordinates and explained their engine failure and life support problems. Again, the response came impossibly fast. Understood, Stellar Wind. We are en route to your position. Estimated arrival time is 47 minutes. Please reduce all non-essential power consumption to extend your life support. 47 minutes was impossible. Jake checked the distance calculations again. Even the fastest ships in the Galactic Council fleet would need at least 4 hours to cover that distance. The humans would have to travel at nearly twice the theoretical maximum speed for faster-than-light travel. They're lying, Pete said. There's no way they can get here that fast. Maybe they're already closer than we think, Lisa suggested. Maybe they have ships patrolling near the border. Jake was about to respond when their sensors detected something approaching. A ship was dropping out of faster-than-light travel, less than 1 million kilometers away. The energy signature was unlike anything in their databases. More importantly, it had arrived in exactly 47 minutes. The human ship was smaller than Jake had expected, about the same size as the Stellar Wind. It looked sleek and functional with no obvious weapons or defensive systems. As it drew closer, Jake could see that the hull was marked with symbols he didn't recognize and a name painted in neat letters. UES Horizon. Stellar Wind, this is Captain Watson. We're moving into position to assist you. Is your crew prepared for emergency docking procedures? Jake had never heard of emergency docking procedures. Most ships required hours of careful maneuvering and multiple safety checks before attempting to dock. Captain Watson, our docking systems are damaged. We're not sure if we can achieve a safe connection. No problem. We'll handle the connection from our end. Just keep your ship stable. Through the viewports, Jake watched the human ship approach with smooth, confident movements. Instead of the careful, slow approach that standard docking procedures required, the Horizon moved with quick, precise adjustments that should have been dangerous. Yet somehow the ship aligned perfectly with their docking port and made contact with a gentle bump that barely registered on their sensors. Docking complete, Captain Watson announced. Permission to come aboard? Jake looked at Vextar, who was now making continuous clicking sounds of distress. The Zephyrian captain nodded reluctantly, knowing they had no choice if they wanted to survive. The airlock cycled open, and 3 humans stepped aboard the Stellar Wind. Captain Amy Watson was a middle-aged woman with short brown hair and calm, intelligent eyes. She was followed by a younger man wearing an engineering uniform and a woman carrying what appeared to be medical equipment. I'm Amy Watson, the captain said, extending her hand in what Jake recognized as a human greeting gesture. This is Ryan Clark, our tactical officer, and Dr. Helen Rodriguez, our medical officer. How can we help? Jake shook her hand, surprised by how normal and friendly she seemed. After reading the ancient reports about humans, he had expected something more dramatic or frightening. Instead, Captain Watson seemed like any other professional spacer. Our main engine is completely dead, Jake explained. We've lost most of our backup systems too. Without help, we'll run out of life support in about 4 hours. Ryan Clark was already moving toward the engine compartment with Pete Collins. Mind if I take a look at your propulsion system? I might be able to suggest some fixes. Dr. Rodriguez was scanning the alien crew members with a handheld device. Are any of you experiencing symptoms from life support failure? Difficulty breathing, fatigue, nausea? How do you know about Zephyrian physiology? Vexitar asked suspiciously. I don't, Dr. Rodriguez said simply. But physiology is physiology. Carbon-based life forms have similar basic needs regardless of their evolutionary origin. Jake followed Ryan and Pete to the engine room, curious to see what the human engineer would make of their damaged systems. What he saw there made him question everything he thought he knew about technology and physics. Ryan was examining the burned-out fusion reactor core with a handheld scanner. After a few minutes, he turned to Pete with a puzzled expression. This reactor shouldn't have failed. According to these readings, all the components are within normal operating parameters. But it's completely dead, Pete protested. Look at the power output readings. 0 across the board. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. The hardware is fine. It's just that the reactor has forgotten how to work. He opened his toolkit and pulled out several devices that Jake didn't recognize. Let me remind it. For the next 20 minutes, Jake watched Ryan work on their reactor with techniques that made no sense. Instead of replacing damaged components or making mechanical repairs, the human engineer seemed to be talking to the machinery. He would adjust settings, run brief tests, then adjust them again based on what appeared to be pure intuition. There we go, Ryan said finally. Try starting it now. Pete activated the startup sequence with little hope of success. To everyone's amazement except Ryan's, the reactor immediately came online with perfect readings across all systems. Not only was it working, it was operating more efficiently than it had in years. How did you do that? Pete asked in amazement. Ryan shrugged, casually. The reactor was working fine. It just needed someone to convince it that it should keep working. Sometimes machines get confused and forget what they're supposed to do. Jake stared at the perfectly functioning reactor and felt the same fear that had driven the galaxy to quarantine human space. This wasn't advanced technology or superior engineering. This was something far more disturbing. The humans had somehow convinced a broken machine to work by simply believing it should work. Jake Martinez stared at the red warning lights flashing across his ship's control panel and felt his stomach drop. The stellar wind had been his home for 12 years, carrying trade goods between the outer rim worlds and the galactic core. He knew every sound the ship made, every vibration that meant trouble. Right now, everything was wrong. Captain, the main engine is completely dead, said Pete Collins from the engineering station. The young human looked pale as he read the diagnostic reports. The backup systems are failing too. We have maybe 6 hours of life support left. Lisa Brown turned from her navigation console with worry written across her face. Sir, we're drifting toward the Forbidden Zone. The human territory boundary is less than 2 light years away. The Zephyrian crew members immediately began making nervous clicking sounds with their mandibles. Captain Vextar, the ship's Zephyrian owner, rose from his seat with all 4 arms trembling, his large black eyes fixed on the star chart display, showing their position relative to the dreaded red line that marked human space. Absolutely not, Vextar said in his translated voice. We do not send signals toward human territory. We do not enter their space. We do not make contact. These are the oldest laws in the galaxy. Jake had heard the stories since he was a child, working the shipping lanes. Every spacefaring race knew about the humans. They lived in a large sphere of space around their home world, and for over 1,000 years, every major civilization had agreed to stay away. The Galactic Council had made it official policy. No trade, no communication, no contact of any kind. But Captain, Lisa said carefully, we're going to die out here if we don't get help. The humans are the only ones close enough to reach us, in time. Vextar's translator made harsh buzzing sounds. Better to die with honor than to risk what contact with humans might bring. They are not like us. They do not follow the natural order of things. Jake walked to the small archive console and pulled up the old records. Every ship carried copies of the historical files about humanity, though most crews never bothered to read them. The files were marked with the highest security classifications and came with warnings about the dangerous nature of the information contained within. Pete, help me access these files, Jake said. I want to know exactly why we're supposed to be so afraid of humans. The first records dated back nearly 1,500 years to when the Zephyrian Empire first discovered Earth. The initial reports seemed normal enough. A young species had developed faster than light travel and was beginning to explore their local region of space. The Zephyrians had sent a scientific expedition to study them and make first contact. The expedition logs started normally. The lead scientist wrote about human biology, their technology levels, and their social structures. Everything seemed routine for a first contact mission. Then the reports began to change. Day 43, Jake read aloud. The humans have shown us their manufacturing facilities. According to our calculations, their production rates should be impossible given their energy inputs and raw materials. When asked to explain, they said they simply needed the resources more than physics needed to be consistent. Lisa frowned. That doesn't make sense. Jake continued reading. Day 58. Human engineers have repaired our damaged sensor array, using materials that should not be compatible with our technology. When our chief engineer insisted the repair would not work, the humans said they would convince it to work anyway. The repair is functioning perfectly. The reports grew stranger. Human doctors treating Zephyrian crew members with medicines that had no scientific basis for working on alien biology, yet achieving perfect results. Human mechanics fixing Zephyrian equipment with techniques that violated known engineering principles. Human scientists casually discussing discoveries that overturned fundamental laws of physics. Day 91. Jake read with growing unease. I am beginning to understand why the humans frighten me. It is not their technology or their weapons. It is their complete refusal to accept limitations. When we tell them something is impossible, they ask why. When we explain the scientific principles that make it impossible, they find ways around those principles. They do not see rules as barriers. They see them as suggestions. The final entry in the expedition log was brief and terrifying. Day 112. We are returning to Zephyrian space immediately. I recommend that all contact with humanity be forbidden. They possess something that could destroy the foundation of galactic civilization. They do not accept that some things cannot be done. If this attitude spreads to other species, the natural order that has governed the galaxy for millions of years will collapse. They must be contained. Jake closed the file and looked around at his crew. The Zephyrians were clearly agitated, their mandibles clicking rapidly. Even Pete and Lisa looked disturbed by what they had heard. That's just old superstition, Pete said, though his voice lacked confidence. Humans can't actually break the laws of physics. Can't they? Lisa asked quietly. I've heard rumors from traders who work the border regions. Stories about human ships that move faster than they should be able to. About human colonies on worlds that should be uninhabitable. Vextar made a sound like grinding metal. Those are exactly the stories that prove why we must not make contact. Humans are a virus that spreads impossible ideas. They convince reality itself to bend to their will. The ship shuddered as another system failed. The lights dimmed, and the air recycling system made a grinding noise before going silent. Jake looked at the countdown timer showing their remaining life support. 5 hours and 37 minutes. Captain, he said to Vextar, with respect, I don't care if humans can bend reality. I care about keeping my crew alive. Jake moved to the communications console and began charging the emergency beacon. The Zephyrian captain tried to stop him, but Pete and Lisa moved to block his path. You will doom us all, Vextar said. Humans do not simply help. They change everything they touch. If we contact them, we can never go back to the way things were. Jake paused with his hand over the transmission controls. Around him, his crew waited to see what choice he would make. Save their lives by breaking the most sacred law in galactic civilization, or die with their principles intact. The ship shuddered again, as life support dropped to critical levels. Jake made his choice and activated the emergency beacon, sending a desperate message toward human space. Within minutes, they received a response that would change everything they thought they knew about the galaxy.